far in the game design class, we've been looking at a lot of design elements, looking at like designing trains and levels and things like that. We're going to look a little more in depth at C sharp programming and programming in Unity during this one. And as a resource, we're going to create a simple inventory system. We'll do that in the next video, but to this video we'll just review some C sharp programming tips, especially related to Unity, and try to tie some things together. This is a video from the software design course where we also use C sharp, and does a little review of Java versus C sharp. You might want to see this. This is some of the highlights from that video. In Java, we use system.out.println. In C Sharp, there's something called console.writeLine that replaces that, but that's not available in Unity. Instead, in Mono Developer, or Mono Behavior, there's something called a print method we can use. But generally, when we were printing out, we're doing it to debug a program and see some errors or something like that, because the interface is not going to be through console, but through some sort of GUI. So generally, in Java, where you do a print line, I would suggest we use debug.log to print out to console that way. A number of other things that are slightly different. Java and C Sharp are very similar, but there are some small differences you'll notice, like Boolean is bool in C Sharp. Math.square root is math.square root with a capital S in C Sharp. C Sharp has a number of methods that start with the capital letters. Date in C Sharp, there's a date time method, but again in Unity we have to say system.datetime .now or something like that. To do inheritance, we do extends, employee extends person class. Here we just use a colon, so we just say employee colon person to show that the employee inherits from the person class. The way you call the superclass, like the constructor, again, that's not a big thing within Unity. One thing we'll look at a little bit more is properties in Unity. Often if you have a class, like an employee class, and you declare an object, and then you have getters and setters in that class in Java, so you say emp.getName to get an employee's name, or emp.setName and pass it a name there. In C Sharp, we'll often define, rather than saying using getters or setters, we'll have kind of those built into what are called properties. And so we'll still have getters and setters, but you'll access them differently. So you'll more like attributes. So you'd say emp.name and emp.name. So you could set it equal to or use it some way instead of doing this get name or set name. We'll see some more of that as properties are built up. Here's a couple written tutorials that are good reviews comparing C Sharp to Java. And this is a nice review from Microsoft of C Sharp. It's like 15 videos, each about 20-minute long, that reviews C Sharp fundamentals. It kind of goes over all the concepts in C Sharp, loops, assignment statements, that sort of stuff. So if you don't if you don't remember Java, or you think your programming is kind of weak, you need a refresher course or something like this, this is a good place to go for that in C Sharp. But where we want to really go today is jump into this collisions and accessing components and things like that in Unity. Some Unity kind of specific areas of programming. So first thing we want to look at is detecting collisions with objects. And the first one is this on collision enter here. So this link here is to a tutorial that walks you through the collision detection, but we'll look at some of this code here for detecting collisions. We're going to look at two different types of collisions in this, using triggers and also just a normal collision here. Some of the code we'll be looking at is in this sample code thing, so if you want to copy and paste some of this out, you can. This is the some of the collision detection we'll be doing to start with, but then we'll build on this as we go. So first, I've got a simple project over here. I've created a Unity project. So in this Unity project, you can create this from scratch. It's not that hard, so I'll just walk you through how to do this. First thing we do is import some standard assets. So we have the standard assets imported. So if you right click in your assets folder and do import package and do characters, you can do that. Sorry, I can't see that, but just import packages, characters, and bring in all the packages. And so that'll bring up your standard assets. Under there, under standard assets then in characters, there'll be rollerball, and under rollerball there'll be prefab and a rollerball prefab. Just drag that off into your screen. Here's my rollerball here. And that'll be put here. So then you can just, that's just a simple version of the rollerball that we can drive around. So when we play this, we can just drive it around a little bit. So the rollerball will be able to drive around. And we'll also play with the first person and third person controllers. So you'll import those also here. Besides that, so we added the rollerball. The floor here that we're building on is just a cube. So bring in the cube. I dropped it down a little bit so that it would be below some of these other assets. Otherwise, you just have to kind of make sure these assets don't all go right on top of it. And I just renamed it as floor and made it 20x and 20z, so it's just a little bigger. So that's my floor, is just a cube that's resized to 20 by 20. I also just added a red cube here. So again, this is just a cube. I created a new material down here, create material, and named it red material and changed its color to red here. So it would be red. And likewise, I made some walls here, and I duplicated those. So made some walls from a cube. So cube, and made it 3 in the X direction. I made some blue material just so that it's easier to tell them from the red wall. So again, mainly just adding these cubes and resizing them. So something to be aware of now as we're doing some programming is the relationship between game objects and components. So these are game objects we're creating here. These in our sample scenes and generally in our assets folder are game objects often. And each game object, like the rollerball game object, is going to have some different components. And so these are the components that here. So it often will have things like a sphere collider and a rigid body and scripts that we have. So we're going to go up to our rollerball and add a script. So I just said add component to it. And I scrolled down to new, you can't see this, new component, new script, and created a C# script. And I called it collide check script. And that saves it in the assets folder, but it's tied to the rollerball. So the rollerball actually has 3 scripts. It has the ball script that comes with it, and the ball user control script here, and then this new collide check script. So now I'm going to edit that, so I can go in here and choose edit script. Sorry, you can't see that either, but that's an option in that menu. Or I can again double click it in the assets folder. So and that'll bring it up in Visual Studio here. And here's our initial thing. Initially, we used to start with a start and an update method. So we're just going to make sure we know what those do to start with. So I'm going to do a debug log and say in start, and debug log and say in update. And I'm going to ignore these other ones for now, but because this is what you can do to start with. And I think it's useful to actually go through and recreate this and try to play with different things in Unity to make sure you're understanding things when you're learning these. So I'm going to make sure my console window is open. If you don't see it somewhere, go to here and do console window and put it somewhere. You want to see it while you're running your game. So sometimes I pull this out onto another monitor or another part of my screen by just dragging it. But I'm leaving it here now so you can see it during the recording. Now when I play my game, I'm going to watch the console window, and I'm going to stop right away. Because what it does is it prints out in start, and then it says, oh, there's some collision stuff we'll talk about in a sec. And then it says in update, in update, in update. There's a whole series of these in update, in update, in update. So that's what it's running, is all these in updates again and again. Because again, start is run once at the start, and then update is run repeatedly again and again, like 30 times a second or something like that. So I actually don't want all these updates to be displayed, so I'm going to comment that out now that I know it's working. So let's look at some collisions. There's two kinds of collisions. You can add an on collision enter or an on trigger enter. We're going to look at the difference between those. On collision enter again takes a collision object, and here in the example from the text or from Unity it was just called COL call. On trigger takes a collider, slightly different object, and again in the example they called it other, so I'm just leaving it there. So whatever name of the parameter it is, you just have to make sure you use that in your code within that method, of course. So here we're going to just print out that we're doing a collision, debug.log collision with, and then I'm going to, both of these things will give you access to the game object you're colliding with. So you can say the name of the variable dot game object dot name, and that'll get you the game object's name. Or like here, other dot game object dot name also. So one is a collision, one is a trigger. So let's see which one runs when we run our program. So I'm going to make sure I save this, switch back to Unity, and run this. Okay, so initially we start, and then there's a collision as our ball drops down and hits the floor. We see that collision. And if I go ahead and hit this red cube, there's some repeated collisions. There's a collision with the floor, and it often bumps up a little bit and hits the, it bumps up and drops on the floor again. So sometimes I get a floor collision when I collide with the red ball here. And same way with the blue ball, so I'm colliding with different things. But no triggers, just collisions here. So only this was done. Now I can switch it around with the red object, the red cube here. So collisions are kind of a rigid object sort of stuff, and so my roller ball has a rigid object and some physics in place, and so that does the collisions. Every object has, besides, every object has a mesh. So the mesh is what draws the object, like the mesh renderer. If I take that away, it doesn't actually draw the object. So the mesh is what's displayed, but also there's a collider. So the collider is what detects collisions, and they're often the same shape, but sometimes we make them this collider to be more approximate. So we can actually put like a box collider around this, something that would be easier to calculate collisions with. Especially when we bring in meshes, when we go here and we add components, sometimes we'll just use some simple colliders rather than a complicated mesh collider, which requires more calculations to compute collisions. But we don't have to worry too much about that. So the collisions are being done here with the ball. Okay, but now with my red cube, I can turn that into what is called a trigger. So I'm going to go to my red cube and click on the trigger under box collider. And then run this. And now when I run into the red box, I'll go right through it actually, and I can get, I'll get a trigger event. So now we've eliminated some of the physics stuff and we're just doing triggers. So sometimes you want to do that maybe when you're picking up something you don't want to actually run into it. You just want to pick up some ammunition or some apple or something that's in your game, some game object. So here I'm doing triggers. I go right through it, but I get a trigger event as long as its trigger is set there. Now that was set in the red cube here. Now if I were to set, you think maybe I could just set that so I wanted everything to trigger. I could just set my ball to be a trigger. But if I go and look at my collider for the ball and click there, now that's going to disable physics, and so when I run this, my ball is not going to have any physics. It's just going to drop right through the floor. There it goes. Bye bye. So we don't generally want to do that. So if we do want to, we generally have your player set, and then you can put triggers on the other objects out here that you collide with. Okay, so if we have triggers set, the on trigger enter is triggered. Otherwise, on collision entered is checked. Now, at times, like we collide with the floor, the red wall, or the red cube, and the blue walls and stuff. And let's say we only want to do something when we collide with the red walls. So we can change our code to kind of check for that. So here I've surrounded my debug statement with an if statement and checked the game object name. So I can just say if my collide object, collision object dot game object dot name is red cube. And again, that's what it's called here, red cube. If it is, then I'm going to say collision with and then print that name off again because I was already doing that. So in this case, we won't get, the collisions with the floor and the blue walls will be ignored. So when we run this, again, we won't see the collision with the floor. Oops, I forgot to save. Okay, go back here, make sure I'm saving this. I just use Control S for save. Now I'm going to go back here and run this. And now I shouldn't see a collision with the floor when I run this. So no floor collision, just to start. And then again, when I bump into the red wall, I'll see that collision. Oops, we're not getting that. Okay, again, the name here has to be spelt the same as the name here for this to work. So let's make sure we stop running, save this, and run it again. And now we'll see that should work. Now, besides checking for a name, sometimes you'll want to do that because you'll know the name of the object. But oftentimes you'll have like blue wall 1, blue wall 2, and you want to check all of those. Or you might be creating, we'll be creating objects from prefabs inside code, and we may not know the names of those because again, each name is unique, and every object has a unique name, and they're not always the same. So another way to doing this is to do tags. So we can create tags here. So here I've got my red cube and I've tagged it as an item, and I've got my walls and I've tagged them as walls. So in here, if you can add tags and generate as many tags as you want. So using this plus, you can add as many tags as you want. I've created an item tag and a wall tag. So now once I've created a couple tags, I can go to red cube and select item. I can go to my walls and mark them as walls. So once you have that, then in your code, you can do, rather than checking if a game object's name is cube, I can check if its tag is item or something like that. That's item is how I tag the red cube. And I can have a bunch of things tagged item here. So now I'm checking for collisions and only worried about things that are tagged items. So tags are another way of manipulating and checking for things. So now if I bump into this, I'll get that red cube will be, but if I bump into things that aren't red cubes, nothing will be displayed here. And the same thing I could do with triggers. I could check for tags and triggers too. So again, we have triggers and we have collisions. I'm going to switch to the first person control and show that has some differences. So I'm going to go to my roller ball here. I'm just going to disable it so it's still here but not have to worry about it. And then I'm going to go to my project, go to standard assets, find the first person controller, find the game assets, and just grab this first person controller and drag it out onto the screen. Maybe lift it up a little bit here. So I have my first person controller. I'm going to run this. Now there's going to be a warning here in my console where I have two audio sources. Oops, I already fixed that, I guess. So if you've done this, you probably will get a warning that there are two audio sources here. So there are audio listeners. So in a 3D world, we have audio sources, things that make sounds. We also have listeners, things that listen to sounds. And we generally want just one listener in our game. We can have multiple audio sources, things that are making noise. But then we usually put the listener on the character or the camera or something like that. And then as your character gets closer to the waterfall, it should get louder, that source of noise. And if it moves away from it, so all that is calculated for us based on this audio listener. But we only want one. And by default, there's one in the main camera and there's one in the first person controller. there's a camera or component hidden in there. So you want to go to your camera and just disable that audio listener so that you get this. We also want to go to our first-person controller and we want to go and add our asset, our script to it, collider check. I'm going to drag that onto this. So let's just bring these up a little bit. So collider check. So when the player, just like when the roller ball collided with things, we did a check. We're going to do the same thing here. We're going to check. And in fact, I'm not going to worry about this if then here. I'm just going to, well, here, we'll do it both ways. I'm just going to always print off every collision that's out there. It's just so I can see if I get any collisions with anything. And in fact, I'm not going to. So now I'm going to run this here. Bring up my console, hit play. Okay, I can move around. I can walk into my red thing, but I can't go through it. Same with these blue walls and the floor. I'm not running into any. I mean, I can run into anything. They all stop me, but there's no collisions being generated. That's because the first-person controller, the way it's set up, it doesn't do collisions like a normal object. It kind of has a rigid body, but it's not set up the same way as normal rigid bodies are. It's set up to use kinematic stuff, and so it doesn't do it doesn't do collisions. So there's a special code we can put in for that. So if we're going to be using a first-person controller, the normal one, we have to add some different code for collisions. So here's our controller. So rather than saying on collision enter or on trigger enter, it's on controller collider hit. Really long method here. And we're given a controller collider hit. We're just calling it hit at this point. And so again, I'm checking if its name is red cube or it's tagged an item, and then I'm printing it off. And again, we can get to the game object from this hit. So in some ways, it's similar, very analogous to these other two, but it just has a different name and only works for the controller. Okay, so I'm going to save that, go back to my game, and run it. And now I'll be, that collider will work. So I run into the game. Now notice that a whole bunch of collisions happen when I did that. A whole bunch of them happen. So it is kind of weird is that I get a whole sequence because again it's kind of a complex object and lots of, I don't know why, it's just lots of collisions right away with it. If you're using the first-person controller, this is the one you should use as on controller collider hit. Now there are some other options. So I'm going to delete this first-person controller. I'm going to go back in my project, and there's also a rigid body first-person controller, which is a slightly different movement, and this has a normal rigid body and physics built in. So if I use this one and move around, it will use standard collisions, if I remember correctly. Upset spring, man. Where's my console hit escape? Oh, yes. But I have to put my script on it, so it doesn't have my script. So I'm going there, going to my project, going to my script, find my script, and add it as a component to that. I can also go down here and find it and add it that way, but I'm used to just dragging on there. Okay, so now it's on there. Bring up my console, run it. And when I run into my red cube, it will do it. Now I'm also seeing collisions with the floor because again, I'm not under collisions. I'm just putting all sorts of collisions in there. So again, if I want to restrict that, I can get rid of this statement and only check if I'm touching an object named red cube, or in this case, an object tagged item, and then print that out. So again, the first-person controller, this one, first-person controller rigid body, gives you the normal collisions with rigid body. Similarly, okay, I'm going to disable this one for now and go and look at. So besides the first person and the rollerball, the third person one, there's not the AI one, but there's a normal third person controller here that we use. that should use standard collisions too. So again, I'm going to have to remember to drag my object on there. Let's see, make sure it's there. Oh yeah, capsule collider. No, that's the there, collide check. So I've added my script to this, and now if I move around, and I walk into an object, I will get that collision checked. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of my third body, third person one, and re-enable my rigid body controller. So again, of these, you just have to keep track of them. Third body controller, first body, rigid body controller, and the roller ball all have normal rigid bodies, and all have physics. The only one that's weird is the first person controller. That uses the special controller collider hit. So if you use that first person controller, you have to use this instead of this. And again, you can either enable triggers or collisions. You generally can't do both in your objects. Okay, so let's jump back into our code a little bit. Ball here. Okay, so inside our roller ball, again, we have our script. We have our collide check script. But inside that script, I can define a public game object. So I'm going to put public game object. I'm going to call it wall up here. If I make it public and save it, it shows up as a parameter here. And originally it starts off blank, no game object. And then I can say which one of my walls. So I'm going to do this wall here, going to drag and drop that. Oops, I've got to make sure I have the roller ball with that script and the wall slot there. And then I'm going to just drag that and drop it in there. So this is what, again, the code talks about as assigning things through an inspector assign reference. So we declare a public variable, or you can declare a serializable private variable, but I often just use a public variable here. And then we can assign it through this interface. So now we have this wall, I have this variable called game object wall. So when I collide with an item here, I'm going to print off the debug statement. I also want to go to my wall and destroy it. I can say destroy wall. Here I can just say destroy wall if I wanted. And destroy the wall that way. I can also just disable the wall. I can say wall dot set active to false, and that would make it inactive. So either way generally works. So I'm going to save this, go back here. If I run this, and then when I collide with this red cube or anything that's labeled item, this wall here in front of me should be removed. Let's see if I can actually collide there. And then that wall was removed. So again, we can do this publicly defined inspector assignable references through public variables. But we can also do some searching. So sometimes we want to do this sort of searching with a find. Here they're doing it through transform. I'm going to use this different way of using game objects to find this stuff. So let's say I code, because again, maybe there are times when you do want to do this publicly assigned stuff where it is a set thing, but other times where I want to find everything tagged a certain way, or everything that or find the same name. And sometimes you don't want to have a whole bunch of this assignment stuff. For example, your rollerball, if your main camera wants to follow this, every time you create a rollerball, you don't want to have to find the main camera and remember to drag it up and set it up. It gets kind of complicated to set up these complicated interrelationships. So in those cases, you just want to be better just to find the main camera and inside code take care of that. So let's say we're going to find a blue wall and take care of it inside code. So rather than doing it this way, we want to do it a different way. So rather than using this wall variable, I'm going to declare a new variable and set it here. I'm going to declare a game object called myWall. And I'm just going to use a static, but like I say, GameObject.find and specify the name. This is find by name. It's just find, but it finds an object by name. Every name should be unique, so it should just hopefully find one object or an object with that name here and return it. And then once I have that, I can disable it. So now I can, once I have that wall, I can say mywall dot set active. Oops. Do false to get rid of it. So this will work. Now, one problem is that what if it doesn't find the wall? It'll give me an error message. Let's save this and see what happens. The first time the wall is going to be there, but in subsequent examples, the wall won't be there. So again, first time I'm going through, I hit it, the wall is there, but next time I hit it, and so now I'm getting these null reference exception errors in my counts. Every time I hit that, I'm getting this error again. And the reason is that I'm just trying to it's trying to find this blue wall and it's not there anymore, and this becomes a null object, and I'm using null to try to call this. So I should be doing a check here. If my wall does not equal null, then I should be doing this. Only delete it if it's there, and that'll get rid of that error. So I can use find by name. Now this takes a while because it searches through all of my objects. Now in here I only have a couple objects. Now yeah, I actually have more than it might appear because well, actually, rollerballs from it, but like if you had a first-person controller and stuff like that, there's objects inside objects. So it's not uncommon in a full game to have like a couple hundred, if not 1,000 objects in your hierarchy, and if you have to search through those, it can take a while. So find is slow, and you particularly do not want to do a find in an update. Update runs many times a second, and find actually, this might run 30 times a second, and find itself might take 1/10 of a second or something like that. I don't know. It's slow, and so you generally don't want to do find inside here. Now there are other ways of doing this. So often we could move this up here and do it at the start and just use the variable other place. Now here I'm doing it to collision. Again, collisions don't occur that often, so I don't mind doing it right here in my collision check. Although, again, you could also move it up and do it in start, which is where we often do these finds. So we can find by an object. We can also find an object by tag. So rather than doing this this find, I can do a game object dot find with tag. Find with tag. So I can do find with tag to find that. And it just finds one game object with that tag and deletes it for us. So now if I run this, it will find one of the game objects and show it. So the first time it'll just find something tagged with that and delete it. And then if, now there's no more objects. Let's see. Oh, yeah. I want to say find objects tagged with wall, because all of these objects should be tagged as wall. So I have to make sure I use the tag and not the name here. So I'm going to find that and then delete that. Okay, save that, Go back here, run this. Now this find with tag finds one object with the tag. You can also find all the objects that are tagged, and you'll get back a collection on like an array. So there's one. I hit this again, I'll find a different object with a tag, and then a different object with a tag. So every time it just gives you one object with a tag. Okay, going back here. So again, they talk about going through this hierarchy or locating things by tags with this find with tag methods. Likewise, there's a find game objects with tags, game objects with an S with tag, and that'll return an array. So like if I say find game objects with tag, and this is an array of game objects that's returned, and then I can say for each of those objects, and I can use for each loop through all those objects and do things. So it's possible to find all the objects with the tag and then use a for each loop to loop through all those game objects and do something. But we're not. I'm not going to illustrate that right now. Now here's a couple references that you might want to read that talks about, so like find is slowest, find with tag is a little faster but still relatively slow, and so both of those we generally want to do either just in a collision or even better yet just at the start, not in updates or fixed update or anything like that. Same with if you declare an object as a public object like this and then assign it, that's going to be really fast because we already have that reference to it. So we have to balance all those parts out as we do this code. So that wraps up this project and the code for this project. Just shows you things. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is trying to using this to create a simple inventory system in the next video.